Hey folks, it's Lucid. Welcome back. This is going to be a another entry in the new player guide. I'm going to make these reasonably quick. I was thinking, do I combine these into one video, or do I split them up? I decided we're going to split them up. We had a really long first video, about an hour. These are going to be hopefully significantly shorter. So what we're going to talk about in this one was a question brought up in the comments of last one. I had asked you guys to let me know kind of what are some other topics you'd like me to cover that are just really kind of elemental and basic. And one of the things you guys said was, I want to know, like, how can I know if I can expand into a province? So, like, how do I know if I'm going to win a fight? Because I was walking around here expanding. We're not losing hardly anything, fighting. Like, how am I knowing it's going to go like this? When you're getting in the game for the first time, you probably attack and you lose a ton of stuff. Right. So how do we understand whether we're going to win or lose? And to understand that, we're going to have to talk about unit stats and like the basic combat mechanics. Now, I'm going to make everything sound a little bit simpler than it is, because I'm not going to the formula for like how damage is calculated and all this. There's so many little bits and bobs and pieces, and you can find the full formula with all the things in the order they get added or subtracted or multiplied on IllWiki. I'll leave a link to it, at least for the Dominions 5 version of the formula. But I don't really want you to go there. Not at the beginning if you're a new player. You don't need to. Some of you are going to like, thinking about it and studying things and really understanding the mechanics. If you're that kind of person, go right ahead. But what I want to give you in this guide are some like rules of thumb, some ways to think about things, some like, not strictly correct, but approximate ways to approach, stats and combat so that you can, open up a game and you will fail less, right? Like, you'll be able to basically know whether you'll be able to take an indie army or not. Okay, so we're going to talk about unit stats. I'm going to do it. I don't know if you remember from the previous new player guide entry, we had this huge pile of barbarians. And one of the things I had told you was that barbarians are scary. I didn't want to attack into them with my pretender god, and that's because they have a lot. They're really strong. They're stronger than your average human. Most humans have a strength of 10. These guys have a strength of 12. And they carry a big two-handed maul. And you tend to do more damage with big two-handed weapons than with a single-handed weapon. So these guys are going to clobber whoever they hit. And so I wanted to wait until I had a lot of troops, and then, then we would attack. And that's what we're doing now. So we'll use this fight to talk about some of the combat statistics. One of the things I had told you before is that you can use the 1, 2, and 3 keys to show like the rolls that are happening, and 4 is the highest. And we'll be using some of that here to get a sense for what's actually happening in combat. First, we'll go through just some of the basic unit stats. So we have hit points. Most of these stats, it'll tell you here like what's average. Like a human normally has 10. Ulm tends to have a bit higher hit points on their units because we've got some really thick boy humans. But yeah, so Ulm has 12, and then they've got, here's the size, this is how big it is. Protection, this is really interesting. So protection, we're not going to go through all the details, but basically you have kind of 3 kinds of protection. One type of protection is natural protection. And this is basically like how thick your skin is. So if you're like a rock golem, you're not wearing armor, but your skin is armor, right? So you have very high natural protection. If you're like a lizard warrior, you're like a lizard man, you have like thick, scaly skin, you might have like a 6 or something natural protection, whereas a rock golem might have like 20. And then if you're, like an elephant or a lion or something with like thick hide, but maybe leather, maybe it's like 3. And then humans tend to have 0 as their natural protection. And that's going to stack with the protection of your armor, but not like 1-to-1, right? Like it's going to add together with diminishing returns. So if you had like 10 natural protection and 10 armor, you don't get 20 total protection. You actually get around like 15. So yeah. And then for your armor, it basically comes in a head slot and a body slot. And depending on where you're hit, and there's mechanics that will determine whether you get hit in the head, hit in the body. Basically, if you have small things with small weapons hitting you, you're likely to get hit in the body. If you have big things or things with really big weapons, you're more likely to get hit in the head. And there's more to it than that, but I'm just giving you like really big picture. Yeah, then that'll determine where you get hit. But even then, it's like a dice roll where you get hit. It's not like it's deterministic. Yeah. And so basically, you're going to have, you can see up here, this is like your protection. This is the base value for the armor and for the head and the body. And then it's going to diminishingly add those together and show you what your final protection is. So this is really the only number you need to really worry about are these down here. So this will just tell you we've got 19 head protection, 19 body protection. That's because that's how much our armor gives, and we have 0 natural protection to add to that. Okay? The important thing is when there's a damage roll. So let's look at the barbarian, and he hits for 24 damage. You can see it right here. What's going to happen is, let's see if we can we'll get an actual roll here where a barbarian's attacking. Barbarian, okay, hit with them all for 2 points of damage. So you can see down here that 24. You remember we pulled it up and we said 24? So that 24 is right here. And that is the damage that the barbarian's doing. Then there's like a random number. So it's 24 plus 4, and then it's versus the protection roll of 19. If you remember, that's how much protection these guys have. 19 plus 7, that's a random armor number getting added to it. And then the result is how much damage you take. So unlike a lot of other games where like your armor is like a percentage reduction or something, that's not how Dominions works. Dominions, it's like your armor is subtractive. So if you have enough armor, they just do 0 damage to you. And a lot of games got rid of that because it's kind of like it can be broken. You just have a unit that has barely high enough protection and then nothing can damage them. And one of the things I want to share, and we're not going to talk about how DRNs work. That's basically the random number system that Dominions uses. But the important thing about all these dice rolls that you see, like this 4 and this 7, is that they're exploding dice, basically. They're a random number, which could, in theory, be infinite. It's like very unlikely it's going to be very high. You know, most of them are going to be just like this, where you see it's like a 4 or a 7. They're kind of low numbers, like maybe something you would get off a normal dice. But they have the potential to be way bigger. So you can never have enough protection where you can guarantee you won't take damage. So I think this is a really interesting way that the stats are set up in Dominions, and it's an important thing to know, which is that basically protection is subtractive. It's not like a divide by thing. But even though it's subtractive, because the random numbers can be, potentially almost infinitely big, because they can't be so big because of these exploding dice, you can still get through the protection, even though it's a subtractive dice roll, even if you don't do that much damage with your weapon. Okay, so that's the protection stat. Very important. And that's one of the things that Ulm is really good at. They have really good protection. They have some of the best armor in the game. Magic resistance, this is how likely you are to resist spells. Now, if the spell is like a lightning bolt spell that just does damage, magic resistance won't help you with that at all, right? What it is good against is if you're being attacked and there's like an affliction check or like a disease check or a decay check. Like any of these like status effect checks, a lot of those things go through magic resistance. There's some like check or die things, or there's some check or take head damage things. Anytime there's like a magic check, a lot of times it goes against magic resistance. 10 is average, or like human, average for human. Mages tend to have higher magic resistance. Other people have more or less, depending, like horses will have less than 10. Horses will have like 6. So, different things have different amounts, but it's basically how likely you are to resist certain types of effects. And the effects tend to be binary. So some things are like pass-fail, and some things are more like the difference between. Like protection and, damage, it's like difference between. Magic resistance tends to be more in the camp of like pass-fail. Morale, this is how likely you are to run. Again, 10 is kind of like the normal value. We got pretty good morale on these guys. 13 is pretty good. But if you click on it, you can see where it comes from. The base of the unit's only 11, but we're fighting in friendly dominions, so we get +1, and then we have a good squad leader, so we get another further +1. But yeah, 13 morale is pretty good. And then strength. This is how strong the unit is physically. And this is going to get added in general to most of the types of damage you're going to do via your weapons. So it's very good for that. The higher strength, the more damage you're going to do. Humans tend to have like 10 strength. But bigger creatures can have 20 or 25 or sometimes even 30 strength. And so you have to imagine if you're adding that strength to the weapon, if you have this pike, for example, is a 5 damage weapon, if you add 30 to it, because it's a huge giant carrying a pike, that's going to be a lot of damage. Now, the other thing that we'll just mention is that sometimes you'll see two-handed weapons. Most weapons, like if he just had a normal short sword and the damage were 5, the damage you would see here would be 15. But the damage is higher than 15 because it's a two-handed weapon. 16, because this is 5 plus 11, not 5 plus 10. But yeah, it's higher than 16. It's 18. And the reason is because it doesn't add, for two-handed weapons, you don't add strength, you add like 1.25 times strength. Attack, this is how likely you are to hit something, and defense is how likely you are to dodge it. So every time a unit attacks, and we'll look at the combat log here, you can see there's an attack roll and a defense roll. So the barbarian hit the pikeneer with a maul for 2 points of damage. He had an attack roll of 15 and a defense roll of 11. Now, what does that mean? A barbarian might have an attack of only 10. So how could he have an attack roll of 15? This is the same thing as before. It's just not showing you the pluses here. So it's really a 10 plus 5. And then it's versus these guys' defense, which is 6. And it's going to be versus 6 plus a number, which in this case is, it was 6 plus 5. And they got a defense roll of 11. Now, this is not a difference thing, really. This is really pass-fail. So if you get higher attack than their defense, then your attack lands. If it's lower, you miss. So the way to think about this when you're looking at kind of stats is that if your enemy, so like the barb, has higher attack than you have defense, they're going to be more likely to hit you than random, right? So if you have even attack and defense, basically, this isn't quite the math, but because the dice rolls are a little weird, but it's essentially like if you have a 10 attack versus 10 defense, it's basically 50-50 who's going to hit. Okay? If you have a little bit more, let's say you have 13 attack. Let's say this guy had 13 attack and this guy had 10 defense. So if it's 13 versus 10, how the math works, and this is important for just kind of approximating, because I can be like, oh, you have 3 higher attack or 3 higher defense. You don't know what that means in terms of like percentage probabilities, right? So if you're 3 higher, and it doesn't matter whether it's 23 versus 20 or 13 versus 10. If you're 3 higher attack versus the enemy's defense, it's going to be you're going to hit about 70% of the time, and they're going to dodge about 30% of the time. All right, and then vice versa. If they're attacking you, so if they've got an attack that's 3 lower than yours, then you're going to dodge 70% of the time. These are really important stats because you can still do a ton, like this guy can do a ton of damage, but if he can't hit, it's not going to do that much. On the other hand, you can hit all the time, but if you don't do enough damage to get through their protection, it doesn't matter that you're hitting. Okay? So those are the most important things. You also have combat speed, which is how fast you move across the map. Precision, which is how accurate you are with arrows. The other important thing here is encumbrance and fatigue. Basically, every time you take an action, you're going to, in general, take the amount of encumbrance points you have. That's how much it's going to cost to do the action. And over time, your fatigue will build up as you take more and more actions. This is going to go up by 3 every round, with the exception that I believe you lose 1 fatigue a round just from kind of being, like catching your breath or something, right? But over time, this guy's going to build up encumbrance. You tend to get encumbrance from heavy armor. Now, barbarians don't have heavy armor. They've got full leather armor that only gives 1 encumbrance. My guys, however, have rather heavy armor, right? This guy's got armor with 3 encumbrance. So he has a base encumbrance of 2, and then he gets another 3 from the armor. You can also get encumbrance added to you for things like heat effects and things like that. So, so that's basically how the stats work. So I'll summarize that because, it's kind of a lot. First, there's going to be an attack roll. That's the first thing that happens. If you have a higher roll, if the person attacking does a higher attack roll than the defender does a defense roll, then there's going to be a damage roll. And the damage is basically going to be how hard do they hit versus your protection. And then, if there's damage, that gets subtracted from your hit points. And if your hit points go below 0, you're dead. So That's basically how it works. Things are more complicated. There's also like, can you repel, which is an important reason I use the pikes. I'm kind of like debating in my mind whether it's worth going through how the repel mechanic works. I'll give you like a very simple high level overview, I think. So one of the things I didn't mention, I mentioned the attack and defense and then the protection rolls. There's another thing, which is before the attack and defense. If this barbarian wants to attack me right here, another thing is if we have a longer weapon. So our weapon is length 5, his weapon is length 2. If our weapon is longer, then we have a chance to repel him. That would be like, you imagine you're attacking like a pike wall, and you're trying to get in close, but they're not going to let you get in close without trying to stab you. So that's kind of what this is meant to mimic, I guess, in terms of like real life combat. So to get past the repel check, if you have really good defense, you can evade it, right? Because the repel is them trying to poke you. So if you have really high defense, you can evade it. Or you can, like, if you have really good morale, you can evade it. The thing to know for you is if you're expanding, if you're fighting guys with really long weapons and you have really low defense, like we have really low defense here. This guy only has 6 defense. If these guys had a longer weapon than us, if they had like a length 6 weapon, there would be a repel check where it's their attack as the repeller against our defense as the attacker, and because we have really bad defense, we would basically fail all the time, right? So knowing what you're going to expand into is going to have a lot to do with understanding the unit stats and how it works. Now, what do we know about these guys? We know they hit really hard, so we don't want them to hit a ton. So all of our guys have really bad defense, so we can't use like high defense units, which aren't going to care that they do a ton of damage. So you can basically try to tank the barbarians by being melee with them, by dodging most of their attacks with your defense. We're not going to do that. We have garbage defense because we have really heavy armor, right? But that's a way to do it with other nations. The other thing you can do is you can try to tank the damage via protection. So there's like defense tanking and protection tanking, right? These guys are definitely not defense tanks. They are protection tanks. However, these guys, they don't do great against defense tanks. Their attack skill isn't amazing. They just hit really, really hard. So these guys are actually very good against protection tanks, which is what we brought. But Ulm is kind of a nation that specializes in protection tanks, right? We didn't really have a great option to bring non-protection tanks that were going to do well in this matchup. But what we can do is, even though we can't dodge them with defense, we can still try to dodge them with repel. And that's so we're bringing a type of unit that has a long enough weapon to repel them so we don't get hit. But you don't have to. You can also just, be like, okay, we have 19 protection, which isn't great. I mean, which is great, but you do a ton more damage. You do 24. It's still probably going to be 3 hits to kill each guy, right? So you'd be like, okay, it's 3 hits to kill you, but we do 18 damage, right? And we're attacking into you. You've got 7 protection. So we're going to be doing like 11 damage a hit. And then if we get a good dice roll, we'll 1-hit kill. So we'll be 1-hit killing them somewhat reliably. And then other times it'll be a 2-hit kill. So we're like, for them, we're kind of like a 3-hit kill. And they, for us, are like it may be something, they'll get 2-hit kills on us sometimes too. But for us, they're like a 1 or 2-hit kill. And then in addition, while we're going to get hit almost every single time because our defense is really low, if they make it past our repel, we have the chance, even though our defense is low, to block some of the attacks with repel. So that was how we kind of figured this out. Now, what is good against barbarians? If we were to just look at this unit and say, what kinds of things are good against them? Well, protection tanking in general is not something you want to do against them because they hit so hard. You can try to defense tank. So if you have units in your roster that have really high defense, this is something to consider. Now, one thing I didn't mention, but this is kind of important when you're dealing with very hard-hitting things, is that defense will include the shield parry value. Let's get somebody that actually has that, like this knight has a shield. So he's got 13 defense. But you can see in here, there's the weapon defense modifier. This is from our flail. And there's the shield defense modifiers. This is -6. And then there's the shield parry. So what does this mean? It means if you add up everything before the shield parry, this is like how likely you are to just cleanly dodge it. So it's 12 plus 3 minus 2 minus 6, right? So it's 12 minus 8, which is 4 plus 3, it's 7, right? So they've got 7 defense to just cleanly dodge it. Nothing happens. But if we look on their card, it doesn't say they have 7. It says they have 13. It's 6 higher. And that 6 higher is because of the shield parry. If you block something with your shield, just think about it. You block something with your shield, it's not like you didn't get hit by this huge cudgel that the enemy struck you with. No, you've been hit. You just blocked it with your shield. So what that means is that your shield is only going to block a certain amount of protection, right? Basically, it's going to block 22 protection. We have really good shields on Ulm. But a lot of times your shields might only block like 10 protection, right? So on a unit that doesn't have a very good shield, which you can see the parry value and the protection value here, on a unit that doesn't have a very good shield, well, there's a pretty good chance that the damage will go through the shield, and then if it gets through the shield, it'll do a check against your armor, and if it gets through that, then it'll hit you. So that's something you might look at a unit that has really high defense, but if the shield has a really low protection value, it may not be actually going to protect you very much. But who's going to be good against barbs? In general, you probably want to pick things that they're not trying to protection tank, right? So high resource units often are not great. And you're going to be looking for things that can defense tank. That tends to go well. And the other option is barbs have really low protection. And missile units tend to not do a ton of damage, right? Oftentimes they're not very killy, like a short bow. I don't know if we can find a short bow here. So like these guys have slings. The slings do 10 damage. It's not going to hurt our All Mights at all. We've got 19 protection. 10 damage won't get through 19 protection hardly ever, right? Short bows are going to have a chance to get through it a little better. Instead of 10, it's 11, and it's piercing, which does a little better job than blunt, which like what the sling was. It's a little better than blunt to get through armor. So this is like a little bit better, but still, it's not going to do much damage to our All Mights. But that 11 damage actually is going to do a fair amount of damage to these barbarians who only have 7 protection. It's going to do, about 4 damage plus DRN. They get hit with 3 arrows, they're going to die, they're going to start getting afflictions. It's going to be a bad day for them. So oftentimes a good way to kill barbarians is by shooting them with arrows, right? The other way, and you can see we did this attack with pretty much a lot bigger army than we've used before, and they're all spread out in a line. And one thing you can do against these kind of glass cannon units like barbarians is you just try to make a nice long line. You try to have good contact really fast. And you try to just, we brought enough guys that each of these guys are going to be trying to kill a barb every turn. Right? And we don't want, because these barbarians are kind of glass cannons, we don't want this battle to go on for long, right? And basically the number of barbarians we can kill every round is essentially going to be dictated by how many guys we brought. Now, these guys are not in good contact with the enemy. But yeah, you generally want to bring enough guys to quickly rout the army. That's the other kind of consideration when you're dealing with barbs. If you're dealing with something like this, it's really nice if you have units with shields. With Ulm, we have high enough protection that the javelins aren't going to hurt us. This is like a very limited ammo ranged attack. A lot of bow and arrows are going to have 12 ammunition, but a javelin will only have 2. So these guys, they have a short bow. The other guys have javelins. There's a lot of ranged attacks in this army. So if our nation was a nation that had a lot of glass cannons, like those barbarians, this actually, while this is not a challenging army for us, for our composition, because we've got high protection, if we were something like the barbarians where we did a ton of damage, we were really killy, but we didn't have shields to block the arrows, and we didn't have thick armor to block the damage that comes past the shields, we would get torn up pretty good by this. So when you're fighting pretty much all of the tribes, the tribes are a little bit different, and we could talk about each of them. I don't think we will. I'll leave that painful discovery to you to figure out which tribes are the scariest. Hint, it may be something that rhymes with Schwolf, but yeah, if you're bringing a killy build that's not high in protection, even if you have a lot of defense is not going to help block an arrow, right? So this guy could have 30 defense. It's not going to help block an arrow. What will help block an arrow is the parry on a shield, right? So, if you have you could be really high defense, you could be low protection, you could be really killy with a big 2-handed weapon, but that's not going to protect you from these ranged attacks. So that's going to give you a sense of like, how good it, what types of things should I bring against this? The other standard things here are like the human infantry. I think I've got a battle somewhere with human infantry. Yeah, like here's some. This is like, workaday human infantry. We've got militia in the front. Militia have not really good stats. They've got low morale, so they run really easily. This is less than 10. The attack skill is nothing to write home about. If you only have 10 defense, these guys are only going to hit you about like, I don't know, like 62% of the time or something. It's going to be reasonably low. I'm sorry, they're only going to hit you like 40% of the time. Had that backwards. So, yeah, they're not going to hit you super often, and then they don't do much damage when they hit. It's just the 13 damage spear, and then, they don't have very good protection. These guys are kind of just trash. And then we've got these guys who are light infantry. There's also heavy infantry, which tend to have a bit more protection. Usually, if there's no cavalry, these human provinces tend to be pretty easy. Yeah, they tend to be on the easier side. Cavalry, though, is really tricky. Cavalry, one of the things that will really get you on Cav, and we can look at it on ours, is they have this single-use lance. They get a charge bonus, and then it can only be used once in battle. Now, basically, this lance is going to blow up the first person it hits. I mean, it's going to be like, they're going to be gone. Not always, but in general. So one thing you don't want to have happen is have these really high damage lances. And this 19, it gets like 6 added to it based on the charge bonus, thereabouts. It's going to be a really high damage attack when it lands, and it's going to have bonus attack. So all it has to do with this charge bonus. Let's see if it says. It doesn't tell you the numbers here, but you'll just have to trust me. It's a whopping bonus to attack and damage for that first strike when it gets used up. It's going to blow a lot of things up. You don't want to have it hit things that you care about a lot. So one of the strategies you want to try doing if you're running into a province that's got a lot of lances in it is you can make militia or some kind of garbage troop, and you can just put it in your army and you put it at the front and you have them run into the cav, and hopefully they absorb all of the lance charges, right? It's Operation Human Shield. You're recruiting guys just so you can throw them on the front line, and they'll eat up the lance charges. And then your real troops will come in behind them, and then they're going to have a much easier job killing the cav. Now, that being said, heavy cavalry is hard. If you're a new player, I'd recommend pinging it. What's a ping? A ping means you just make a commander, like this guy. A lot of times you'll use a scout. This guy's kind of our scout. And you just attack the province, right? Now, if you're moving a scout around, you'll notice there's like a gray arrow. You can hit spacebar or like hit sneak. Right now he's sneaking. If you see a gray arrow, like when this guy moves into a province, it's going to be a darker arrow, and this is gray. So I can click on this sneak and I select move, and then it will tell you how to do it. It'll say hold down control and then left click. And so that's what we'll do. We'll click this guy and we'll hold control and left click. Basically, if you're holding control, it'll make it where you don't stealth move, you normal move instead. So we'll normal move here. And then we're going to go to the army setup screen, right, which is right here. It's the T hotkey, and we're going to script him to retreat. It's the R hotkey, but you just come in here and it's on none. You click retreat and you click OK, right? And then we're going to click on this little army box. We're going to put him at the back like so, and we'll exit out. And then he's going to come here to this province. He's going to attack it, but as soon as he gets there, he'll retreat out. And what this will do is it'll give us an accurate assessment. Oh, no, we can do it here. We'll do it to this province. It'll give us an accurate assessment of how many cavalry are here. The other thing about cavalry is it tends to have reasonably high defense and reasonably high protection in addition to the other good things I talked about. So a lot of times to kill cavalry, you want a combination of things. You want a few units that are going to eat the lance charges and die at the beginning. Then you want people that are going to follow up that usually hit pretty hard and have pretty good attack skill. Those are the things, if you can manage it, that you want to have. Now, you may have to take it with, like, at some level, you have to use the tools you're given, right, to take the lands you need to take. So if you don't have the right tools for the job, like this wasn't really the right tools for the job, but I brought a tremendous number of pikeneers. These are pretty high-quality units, and we brought 40 of them. So we wanted to make sure this worked, even though it wasn't really the perfect unit for this job. It was just the best unit we had. So if you see a really dangerous or spooky heavy cav province, you can just bring extra stuff and then you'll be able to take it. Okay, so sometimes there's sneaky mages hidden in provinces. There's not really a way for me to tell you where or how that's going to happen. That'll just be an unfortunate surprise for you. I'm going to give you now some rules of thumb. Now, these rules of thumb are wrong in the sense that if you follow them, you'll be playing suboptimally, but they're hopefully just a very basic way for you to think about sizing your armies where you don't have any intuition to like know how many guys I should bring to this fight, right? If you're doing a Scales army and you're using troops that cost a lot of resources, so Scales army means it's not sacred troops, it's just our normal troops that are not sacred. If they cost a lot of resources, and we'll say this is like anything over 20, right? These guys are 28. It's a fair amount of resources. The higher the guys in the full black plate steel, these guys are 39. So that's a lot of resources. If you're recruiting guys that are like over 20 resources, kind of a lot of resources, they're usually a slightly higher tier than indies. You can probably, not always, but probably, depending on how good the matchup is based on the various stats of what you're going to be fighting and what you've got, you can often, as you saw here, go in with about half the numbers that the indies have, and expect to win. And if you lose, probably only take smaller, moderate losses, right? So it's like about half. It can be less than that. Like you can go in with less than half if it's a good matchup, you know? So like this fight we just took, we had 20 guys in total and we went against 56. So we went in with less than half and we only took one casualty, right? So, you know, it can depend a lot. If you have a lot of times, and when you're counting things, a lot of times for your own things and for the enemy, you want to count heavy cav more, like for these rules of thumb, like just count it like if there's 20 heavy cav, count them as 40 for this rough math. And if you're bringing, like, if it's like, okay, you know, the enemy has 60 units, that means I should bring 30. If you have heavy cav, you might only need to bring 15. Right? And that would be a pretty safe expansion. Now, this is somewhat conservative. You know, if you have good cav, you might be able to get by with significantly less, maybe only like 12 or 11. But this is just like very rough rule of thumb. If you have sacred troops, right? So we're going to talk about the other kind of elite troops. So one kind of elite troop are Scales troops that cost a fair amount of resources. If you have a sacred troop, we don't actually have any on Ulm, but I can pull up the Pretender panel and we'll look at the monkeys. So the monkeys have these guys, white ones. If you take this is where it's complicated. It's like, it depends. But if you have a good bless for expansion, some kind of really powerful bless that's going to make these guys a lot stronger, it is not uncommon to need only like 20% or less, maybe even 10% if you have a really good bless of the numbers of troops that the enemy is coming with, right? So like if you were going to take this province out with 50 guys in it, it wouldn't be uncommon for like 6 or 7 sacreds to kill this whole stack. You have to be careful about like protecting your commander so your commander doesn't die, especially if you have like a poorly armored priest. But it's not uncommon if you have a very strong bless to be able to take provinces like this, you know, a province with almost 60 indies in it with just 6 or 7 units. If they're really high quality sacreds with a good bless. And it can be, of course, these are just very rough rules of thumb. It can be more extreme than that. Like it could be only 3 units will take it. And some of this you'll find out as you just kind of try whatever nation it is you want to play. Oftentimes, though, you know, like more conservative would be, again, closer to like 10 to 20% is how much you want to bring, right? So it's 60 people, you know, maybe you bring like 10 sacreds. There you would, and it's always a balance, right? Because if you start really trying to push it towards the low end, you'll be able to take the province, but with a bit more attrition. So, you know, that's a very rough rule of thumb. If you're expanding with things that I'll call chaff. So when we were looking earlier, we talked a little bit at the end of last video, the last video about like a bird nation, and they had Spirehorn warriors, which were very cheap to recruit, similar to these guys. This is a nation called Nazca. It's kind of like an Egyptian themed nation. Yeah, these are garbage. They only cost 7 resources compared to ours, which were 28. and the recruitment points are pretty low. Their stats are not that good. They've got only 8 protection compared to our 19. That's a big deal. And then their attack and defense is nothing to write home about. Their defense is also a little artificially inflated by this shield parry of 3. But the shield they have sucks. It's a hide shield that can only protect 11 damage. So they're kind of bad. And then they also don't have great morale. Or it's kind of okay. You know, like, these units are not elite, right? These are not good. In the sense, they may be fine to expand with, but they're not, like, tremendously valuable each individually. However, yeah, these are lances. They get this charge bonus, right? So they're going to... You'll still get to use them after the first turn. Some lances disappear. They get, like, shattered after the charge, and then some you get to keep using. These you get to keep using, but you still get that nice bonus for the first attack. If you especially with like flyers or a lot of any of the chaff kind, if you want to take low attrition, a lot of times you want to outnumber the enemy at least 1-to-1, but oftentimes up to 2-to-1. And so, yeah, if you do that, you're going to win with very few losses. But the idea is you can make a ton of these because they're really cheap, right? So anytime you have a chaff unit that you're making to try to expand with, you need to take the scales where you can make just a tremendous number of them. You make so many of them. And with them, the strategy is to really outnumber the opponents by a lot. Or at least be on par with them with numbers. Now, so what did I say? I said sometimes it's between like 5 and 10%. Sometimes it's between like, 10 and 20%. And then sometimes it's between like, 1-to-1 and 1-to-2 in terms of how many you're bringing. So, but really, it can go anywhere in between. It's not like those are the real thresholds. I'm just giving you some rules of thumb to get started since you don't have any intuition for yourself. But the goal is not to follow those. The goal is to just use that as a starting off point so that you kind of have an idea about what kind of armies to put together. And if you find your armies are dying too much, try putting more in. But I think we've gone through now the basic stats. The other thing I should just mention that we didn't really talk about is that I'll pull up one of my crossbowmen here. Crossbowmen are slow to attack, so you can see number of attacks is 1 out of every 3 rounds. This is going to be common to any crossbow unit you see, except it'll say 1 out of every 2 rounds for most of them. And then they have a limited number of ammunition and they have a range. So that's also important statistics for kind of combat. Okay, so I said this would be a quick video. I don't think it's really that quick. But, combat stats are kind of complicated. This is kind of why I didn't want to go into it in the first video. But hopefully you have a few good rules of thumb and you have a better idea of kind of how to evaluate whether a unit's going to do well. In general, the more protection it has, the more attack it has, the more defense it has, the more hit points it has, the better it's going to do. But of course, there's always trade-offs with everything. So, things that have all the things are going to cost a lot more, and then they're not always worth it. Sometimes it's better to get the cheap stuff. So that's for you to figure out. But the good thing is there's a lot of things that are fine. Even if you find something that's optimal in one situation, there's a good chance it's not optimal in the next one. So, just pick some stuff and hope that it's enough to expand. And yeah, in the next video, we're going to be talking about some cool stuff. We're going to be talking about fort placement. So that's going to be a pretty exciting topic. So tune in then. And yeah, thank you everyone for watching. See ya.